streamed as a podcast. The video recording will only capture the speaker, instructor, and students will not be visible. Your voice, however, may be captured if you ask a question. If you do not wish your voice to be captured, please speak to me so we can determine an alternative means for you to participate. Or feel free to write down a question, pass it to a staff member who can read it for you. We probably can recite next time. Anyway, first I'd like to thank everyone who come to support and celebrate for our newly graduates. I just want to congratulations again for you to achieve this, what have you achieved today. And Dr. Melody Fox and Dr. Nick Purvis will be awarded doctoral degree at the commencement this Sunday. So congratulations. And Dr. Rumi Almag has been already awarded the doctoral degree at the last commencement. And time does go fast, as I always said. I still remember Melody and Jeremy took class with me for the master's degree. Now you're graduating from the PhD. I still remember Nick left me a message before we do a telephone interview, right, from NSF. He said, I have a meeting at this time, can we postpone a little bit to whatever they are? So now you're graduating, that's okay.
We're all grown up.
I think, I just hope, SOIS life actually leave a sweet memory for you. Right, and we will miss you all too. And without further delay, I would like to invite the advisors to introduce our graduates today. And the presentation each will last about 30 minutes and leave 10 minutes for question. And Jerome cannot be joining us today. He is on his way to his job interview. So we will have a recorded version of his presentation. And you can ask a question, either ask Professor Zimmer or you can send email to him. Okay, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Melody J. Fox. I came here to teach as a visiting professor in the fall of 2009, and I had already read her writing before I met her. And that is how prolific an author Melody has become in the field of knowledge organization, and she has kept that up all through her PhD. She's worked as Dean of Instruction at Bryant and Stratton College prior to and throughout the program, so like her, one of her advisors, she worked full-time through the whole PhD. It's quite a treat, isn't it? As an educator, as a matter of fact. So, she has a BA in creative writing, and we'll be learning about how she uses that in a bit. An MA in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her MLIS is from us. She's had 2 sons while she's been in the program, which is quite an accomplishment. She's originally from Minnesota. She's been all over the world, going to knowledge organization conferences. And she knows lots of very interesting words, and you'll be hearing some of those as we go along. Melody.
Thank you. All right, yes, it has been a journey. I was calculating it, and this will be my, this will draw to a close 31 years of formal education. So,
It's just the beginning.
Right, exactly. Beginning. All right, so I presented part of this earlier, I think maybe in the fall. So I'll try to make it a little different and also bring you to the exciting conclusions that have come with this dissertation research. And as with any dissertation, it's way too long to squeeze, so everything will be necessarily at a pretty high level. So if you have questions about the details of things, feel free to ask or email me after the fact. So we have gender as an interplay of rules, which is a quotation from Foucault. Detecting epistemic interplay of medical and legal discourse with sex and gender classification in 4 editions of the Dewey Decimal Classification. Easy as that. All right, so the genesis of this for me was kind of realizing this category crisis that Garber pointed out well before I ever realized it, which was that most of the world accepts this 2-sex, 2-gender system. But now with the recognition and that more and more trans, intersex, and non-conforming gender identities have challenged this binary system that most people sort of understand and don't question. So I started to think, how do these things affect humans and how they live their life? And it usually comes in the form of formal classification. This affects how people that fall into these sort of border categories live their life. So what I wanted to ask is, how does bibliographic classification contribute to this, and where does it all come from? So my research problem stems from sort of this notion that these formal classifications can marginalize non-conforming expressions of sex and of gender and variant sex. And so classification is dependent on what kind of ontology you're basing off of, which is the study of what is, and epistemology and how we know what is. I sound like Bill Clinton right now. Ontological theory, and then I took this big quotation, but the big thing to kind of pay attention to is this: show me your classification and I'll tell you what theory you subscribe to, from Muriel Herlin, who's a big name in the knowledge organization field. And so I kind of took that challenge as my dissertation. So what theory is being used to define and classify sex and gender bibliographically, and where is it coming from? Where is this ontologically coming from? So a summary of my methods. To detect the epistemic influence of discourses, I conducted a modified Foucauldian genealogical discourse analysis on the Dewey Decimal Classification and reviewed medical and legal discourses to see the treatment of non-conforming women, trans people, and intersex people. And these are through these four different editions through 3 slices of time. And by non-conforming women, I focus mainly on women who are trying to do things that men do, mainly work in the professions of medicine and law. So, using the epistemic clues that I will outline shortly, I've tried to figure out what sort of epistemic stance they're using to justify their knowledge claims, and then what kind of social consequences to that group occur. So I compare those stances, then how they work together to create this interplay of rules that defines sex and gender for each of those time frames. All right, so also I use Foucault's notion of the concept, which is that a classification is a micro-location. There's no overarching power, puppet master up there saying this is what gender is, or this is what sex is. I'm using that all these discourses work together and play these little parts and then kind of conglomerate into what the concept is. And so he believes that the subjects are created by the discourse, that there's no transcendent, floaty idea that's stable, floating above all of our minds. And the discourse doesn't create something that's true or false. It's not what is true, it's just what it is at that point in time, okay? So I use the genealogical discourse analysis. He has several varieties because it focuses on epistemology and power, and so what the power play is behind these decisions. All right, so just a note about epistemology, if you are not, this is not in your repertoire. Epistemology kind of determines how much agency people have when it comes to human groups anyway, how you can define yourself. Is someone telling you what you are, or do you have a voice in saying what you are? Okay? It determines who is constructing categories, what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for belonging to a category, and then how stable or unified reality is. So a differing stance will have different answers to these kinds of questions. All right. So looking at sex and gender, just some definition of terms. Non-conforming means you don't follow the cultural rules for gender roles. And that can be a small violation as not painting your toenails, but it can also be taking on a different profession, a profession that is not necessarily within your gender role. It may be something like a man wearing a dress because he wants to, okay? So it can be any sort of violation of these cultural rules. Transgender is more of an umbrella term for having a gender identity different from your physical sex. And transsexual is, I'm using this because it's very big in one of the time frames. It refers to medically or physically transitioning from one sex to the other. It's kind of more specific than transgender. But I tend to use the term trans as more of an umbrella term throughout. Intersex then is an umbrella term for any sort of variation in sex organs that don't necessarily fit into this binary idea that we have. And historically it's been called hermaphrodite, so I will be using that language as well because that's the language of the discourse. So generally when babies are born and someone looks and sees and proclaims what someone's sex is, it's not necessarily fail-safe. The other thing to note is that these terms are provisional. They also change and mean lots of different things to different people, and they don't relate directly to sexual orientation. Okay, off we go. And what I mean by discourse, it can be text, it can be utterances, it can be images, it can be interimplications, which are these sort of rules that are expressed through the discourse. The internal discourse, these are Foucault's kind of terms. Internal discourse that I looked at was the Dewey Decimal Classification itself, and any of the introductory matter, any of the writings that within it, publisher's note. The external discourse that I looked at was legal and medical, so case law, legislation, legal dictionaries, medical jurisprudence texts, which are kind of a mix of medicine and law, medical research, psychological and sexology research, and standards of care. So I went through these discourses and looked for how women, trans, and intersex people were discussed, defined. There are no formal classifications in those discourses, so you don't have a list that says, this is how you do it, this is what you put in a bucket to make a man or a woman or whatever it might be. So I had to draw it from the discourse to create those concepts in interplay. All right, so the places where I found the most defining tended to be in the intersex and transsexual discourse, because they needed to, they needed to put things in buckets, and so they kind of did a lot of defining. Well, it must be a man because he does this, or it must be a woman because she does this. So that's where a lot of it came. And then also, whenever they were defining why women can't do what men do, there also came a lot of definitions there. As I said, I'm using the language of the time period, and as I said also earlier, I'm showing kind of the greatest hits of the discourse because it is impossible to cover in this amount of time. So the clues that I look for is the authority, who is what Foucault would call the enunciative modality, who has the authority to speak and make these decisions, who is listened to, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being one of these categories. Rhetorical space, which is feminist epistemologist Lorraine Coe's concept of what does the space around it look like. So in the classification, what are the allied topics? Where does it fall in the hierarchy? Ontology, I'm looking at as literary warrant. So what are the classificatory decisions based on in what exists? And then fallibility, universality, how are people considering these things provisional? Are they consider them ultimate, unchanging truth? And then Hurlin, oops, I forgot to put the year on there, user groups and interests. He says that you need to look at the groups and what their self-interest is in defining things the way they are. And then also clues in tone, diction, language, etc. All right, so the DDC has changed 4 times in terms of how sex and gender are classified in it. So, spoiler alert, in the first edition there's no women, so I'm going to kind of skip over it here. There's a little bit of gendered stuff, but just for the interest of time, I'm skipping it. The second edition, the 17th and 19th edition were where major changes happened. 23rd is also where some changes happened, but I just looked at that as a where are we now, didn't fully study it. All right, so some limitations. I did follow the ontogeny, or the life of the subject, with women only. I didn't follow for choosing the time frame. So the trans and intersex people are kind of along for the ride, but the changes to them happened at different times. So that's an area of future research. Secondly, discourse is messy and unquantifiable. I think we have an urge to want to number and measure things, and with discourse it's very difficult to do so. So I didn't try to number things or measure things in that regard. Genealogical discourse analysis, as Foucault prescribes it, I did not follow that exactly. I took the things that worked, specifically the concept theory, but one of the things that I did violate is he wanted discrete slices of time without talking about what happened in between, and in some ways, some of the action took place off stage, so I did have to refer to it so that it would make sense when I talked about those slices of time. And finally, intersectionality, any sort of race or class notions they were kind of beyond the scope of the project, but you can just expect that within these realms it's going to be a privileged group that we're discussing, because we're talking about people who are lawyers, physicians, women who don't have to work, and trans and intersex people that can afford health insurance, so on. All right, so into the discourse we go, and again, greatest hits. Late 19th century, if women work, they may lose their reproductive capacities. Obviously, I had 2 kids during this, so that can't be true. But there was an actual physician who wrote a thing saying, we're going to have to ship in women from overseas to have babies because our American women are starting to work and we won't be able to propagate the species. Women are naturally squeamish, born to reproduce and nurture. They also shouldn't mix with men to talk, specifically in medical school. We can't talk about anatomy in the same room as men. That would be immoral. Intersex people, the physician wants to find the true sex. It doesn't matter what the intersex person identifies with or feels or whatever it might be, they're not asked. Typically, doctors looked at gonadal tissue, which is testes or ovaries, to see ultimate proof of what someone was. If they couldn't figure it out from there, because you can't really do surgery at this point without killing the patient, they would go from voice, their likes. One intersex person was determined to be a woman because he enjoyed bright colors. The physician is the ultimate authority, and if you disagree with that authority, it means that you're trying to gain privileges of some sort, whether it's same-sex intimacy, a vote, property rights, whatever that might be. All right, and then finally, trans people are mostly absent from the discourse. They were called concealed sex, and it just was not really there too much. It was not considered a medical issue. All right, so legally, this is, again, where there's a lot of both economic reasons and also physiological and psychological reasons why women can't do things that men do. They draw from medical discourse to some degree, but mostly refer to the law of nature. In legal research, this is said to be code for religious themes, God, but it never actually said anything about God. These are not surprising things. Women are innocent and nurture children, modesty, all this stuff. It's a crime against nature. So you can see the privilege here. Women, there were certainly women who had to work, who had to do these things, but it's a crime against nature. They're unqualified to mix and contend with men. We must protect them at all costs. So in the Dewey Decimal Classification, so the first edition, we did not have women as a class, or men for that matter. But then, after consulting hundreds of experts, Melville Dewey came out with the second edition, and this is where women ended up. This is a famous category. You've probably seen it before. Yes, outcast race. So if you think about mutual exclusivity and hierarchical force and these things, it means women are a type of this, and these are all allied. So I guess you can see the outcast races bits. How are we, cannibalism, scalping, mutilation, things like that, customs of the dead. So this is a famous category. Within the category, though, it looks like it reflects literary warrant a little bit better. These are the things that people were writing about in the time when it came to women. Should we educate women? Should they have legal status? Should they vote? So this one seems a little bit more reasonable. As they're called, hermaphrodites at the time, they were in the first edition in the index, but not as a class, and they were referred to physiology, which I think seems also reasonable. But then once these experts weighed in, they ended up in craniology, referred to craniology, so they don't have their own class. And what craniology is similar to phrenology, and it's beyond me to justify this. It may have something to do with what kinds of books were written on it, but that's where it was. So then, as I said, trans people were not in there. All right, so moving along. So it took 80 years before that Dewey Decimal Classification category changed, so until 1965. So I looked at the discourse leading up to then. In 1952, again, outside of our time frame, Christine Jorgensen had the first successful, sex reassignment. And this apparently was a media circus, like people were being called Christines, and she was all over the news, and there was just a whole great deal of interest in her. And because of that, the medical discourse changed focus to this transsexualism, where you're changing your sex. It began to include a psychological aspect, and even to the point where biology was rejected altogether, where you can actually, if you have an intersex child, you can decide what sex you want that child to be, as long as the parents don't ever tell the kid what happened. It just has to be reinforced by the parent. And so John Money is the biggest name in this. He wrote prolifically. He was kind of the big voice that was heard throughout this. And he coined the terms gender and gender identity. But at this point in time, the people were knocking down the doors of surgeons, and the person who did Christine Jorgensen's surgery, I think he wrote that he got something like 650 letters following the surgery begging him to change their sex. So there was definitely an untapped need, okay? So the legal discourse, there was some things with women, but it was very begrudging. This was kind of a limbo time for women because they were doing things that men could do, but they didn't have the legal right to do so. So one of the legal dictionaries said, kind of nostalgically, we used to be able to use force to restrain our liberty, but now we can't anymore. There was the Equal Pay Act, and then the Civil Rights Act was a big moment because that's when it legally ended sex discrimination. It was not women were added into the bill at the very last second, so there was not a lot of like discussion of this leading up to it. It was kind of it was meant for African Americans, and then women just kind of snuck in at the last second, and happily that helped. But it ended legally, but it didn't end it in practice. Legal dictionaries were not updated, so people were working on old definitions that said things like women are legally incapable of entering contracts and things. Even though that legally wasn't true, they hadn't updated it, so people were working from outdated materials. Psychological profiles began to emerge in law cases that had to do with gender. Usually it was presented as a failure of masculinity of some sort on a sort of zero-sum scale. Legally, there wasn't a whole lot of issue with trans and intersex people because the legal field was interested more in prosecuting people for homosexuality. The doctors who, although this is the one legal aspect, doctors who were willing to perform sex reassignments were being threatened with mayhem laws. There were no laws in place to prosecute this, so they had to find one. And what mayhem legally is, we think of it as like, oh, mayhem, it's crazy. But what it really means is cutting off some sort of finger or putting out a tooth or an eyeball in an ear that renders someone incapable of going to battle. So they saw it as castration, as mayhem. And so no one was ever, at least, there's no record of anyone being prosecuted, but there are record of people being threatened with it. All right, so here's what happened in the Dewey at this point in time. Men got a category, hooray. But as you can see, it's kind of perfunctory. It's just like, man, we got one, and then the women have all these things. And you can definitely see the impact of second-wave feminism, superiority of women. And if you also follow hierarchical force, we know that this is a problem. Sex is a problem. And it's also very sexualized. It's with sex life out of marriage, all these prostitution, celibacy, or without sex, I guess.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you list on 412 and you say scope, is that literally what's in
Yes,
the thing? Okay,
exactly. That's a
fine.
scope note in.
Okay.
So it makes it seem like
And
that's
just
all we're
those two-
talking about here.
And just those two terms?
Exactly.
In that scope note, okay, that's really interesting.
Yep.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem. All right. So hermaphrodites end up in reproduction, which is interesting because people who are intersex usually have problems reproducing. But once you get to the class, there's really no place to put them, and it's a pretty big class, so you just kind of have to guess, I guess. And then transvestism is the term that they're using for trans stuff, and it's a sexual disorder, and other sexual disorder. So as we know, our 9 classes is where the others go. And as you can see, there's more about sex psychology. It's starting to become an aspect of the mind. And then there's sort of a sex and natures that has humans and animals together with the biology part. Okay? So even though this is only, 6 years later, there's so much activity during this time in medical discourse and legal discourse and in women's studies that it necessitated a change right away for the Dewey. So this Money and Earhart, they had kind of come up with this neutrality at birth that I had mentioned before, where a baby is neutral and you just, however it's socially constructed, that's how it's gonna go, and then we can surgically make it match whatever assignment you give it. And this was embraced by feminists because it acknowledged social construction of gender and so on. So the doctors and psychologists determine optimal sex, what's the best sex for this condition, parents enforce it. It usually had to do with the convenience of the medical team, because making a vagina is easier than making a functioning penis. So often it just defaulted that way just because it's easier. So chromosomes and hormones were starting to be added along with the psychology. And then John Money had one influential intersex case study, and he sort of intuited broadly from it, and it influenced practice even to now. There's a pop nonfiction book about it that originated as an article in Rolling Stone that came out in like 1997 about a David Raymer case, the John Joan case. So you see it in the popular culture as well. All right. So legally, now that many people had started to sort of enact their transitions and so forth, they started marrying and divorcing, and that's when the legal issues started. Because people wanted legally they need was this marriage valid? Kind of was the theme. So Corbett and Corbett, this was an English case, but it was very influential because we didn't have any precedent in U.S. law. Your true sex is your birth sex. Doesn't matter what you transition to. Then shortly afterwards, JT versus MT, nope, it's the sex at the time of marriage, so it is or isn't valid. At that point, Title IX was enacted in education, but generally speaking, the concerns were all about fraud and regulating property rights. There was also some, like trans people were often harassed for fraud or concealment and being vagrant, things like that, just anything that they could come up with because we didn't have the precedents for it. All right, so then in Dewey, by 1979, all the sex had been stripped from it, or the sexuality sex, all those other, the social problems, that stuff, and it just became very demographic. Men, women, they still are different, they're not parallel, but they stripped away some of those sexual roles. Okay. What's that?
Kinds of women.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly, specific kinds of women.
Start brainstorming.
Yeah, exactly, I mean, it's, yeah. So, and then with hermaphroditism actually got a class under sexual disorders, and then transvestism was C, sexual deviation. So it went from a disorder to a deviation. So that's what we're looking at here. And I did also, as I said, looked at all the accompanying stuff too to see what Melville Dewey and the other editors had to say about it, but we just don't have time to get that. So now looking at what the epistemology has shown from this, and I'm kind of, for the purpose of the presentation, mashed the time periods together, so I apologize for that. Law is pretty straightforward because it follows the same epistemology throughout all three time frames. Generally, they like to other the women, make them be very different for the purposes really of exclusion. So this law of nature, it used modified justifications though, because at a certain point, discrimination became illegal, and so they had to find a way around it. So it generally was a positivistic approach. There was observations from a limited scope, within a privileged class, intuited broadly, and it resulted in determinism, universalism, essentialism, naturalism, and evil pragmatism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the evil a little bit later. For intersex people, they confounded any kind of universals because you can't, all men have penises, all women have vaginas. You can't you can't look at it and check that. So they did do everything on a case-by-case basis, much more inductive than about women. Trans people it was more about protecting morality and enforcing heteronormativity, and this tended towards more authority, like this is, again, against nature. We need to protect all our gentle people from these others. So medicine, there was kind of an interesting conflict in medicine, because clinical medicine focuses on fixing abnormal things, whereas basic research in medicine, things like anatomy and physiology, focus on creating general laws. So that's more of a rational approach, whereas the clinical medicine is more empirical and pragmatic. The positivism strikes again with women. There's a lot of, women are this way, therefore they can't practice medicine. Women like bright colors, those kinds of things. But as time moved on, it sort of moved towards a more critical realism, and this came through sort of the move towards evidence-based medicine. Critical realism looks at, is more of a fallible, it looks at medicine as not perfect, or knowledge is not perfect and we're moving towards it. We just have to recognize that we'll never have a perfect understanding of it. Intersex people, again, pragmatic. This is usually in the service of fixing some legal problem, like how are we going to solve this legal problem? Let's ask the doctors. And again, it was back to the surgical team, and it pathologized the condition of intersex. Again, trans is pragmatic, but for puzzling out why it happened, how to rehabilitate it, how to fix it. It depended a lot on what were the conceptions of what normal meant. And it also, I also recognized a stance called Constitutive social constructivists, and this was where people, once they heard a story about someone that they recognized, they say, hey, that's me too, and then they conform their story to that. And this is not being used in a pejorative sense. It was more like a recognition that, oh wow, there's others like me. And I never knew until, Christine Jorgensen came along and so forth. But pretty much all of them remained entrenched in this binary notion. You have to fit in one box, you have to fit in the other box. There's no in between. All right, so the DDC naturally is structurally rational because we have, this Aristotelian model. Dewey professes to be pragmatic. I'm going to solve all your information access needs, but it does reflect in reality a limited scope of what Dewey. He's working off the Amherst College Library collection. His experience with women is limited to some degree, or to a lot of degree. Okay, Richard's laughing. A lot of degree, and that is reflected in the discourse, and it does not necessarily match what is said, what is out in the literary warrant. Once Benjamin Custer took over, he tried to make the DDC reflect reality. And this ended up with what I see as a conferralist essentialism, which means that it takes the values of society and makes that the essential qualities, even though it's not necessarily real. The absence and the omission of the trans people and the term transgender did not show up in the DDC until 2011. So we're still working off, even though the vocabulary and the literary warrant is there, they're just ignoring it for whatever reason. Maybe we're waiting for it to change again or whatnot. Intersex, the allied topics, and the dead ends also reflect the discourse. So here's my implications. This is where the magic happens. So bibliographic classification does replicate the attitudes found in the discourse. It does not always exactly match the literary warrant, but in their defense, you do have a huge thing to update, and you can't update it every minute of the day, although they're starting to with their kind of ongoing updates. The differing knowledge generation methods can contribute to both the reification and the undoing of institutional knowledge and discourse. So you may be asking, well, if this is the stances that were taken, how did anything ever change? And while the change agents, they were a few, but they were influential, and they usually took an entirely different stance. So instead of looking positivistically and making laws that apply to everyone, they looked at individual cases and made decisions based on those individual cases. Repetition seems to pass for truth in some discourses, and just as a note, detecting epistemology is difficult because people say they're taking a stance, and in action they do something else. So in my actual dissertation, I noted what they were saying their stance was and what they were actually doing. Epistemology can be used for good or evil. We often think of it in its ideal form to be used for good, but it actually can be used the opposite. The scientific reliance on the observed reduces agency for the person being classified. So if we are always only relying on what we're seeing and not listening and not giving someone a chance to talk and speak, then it limits our ability to understand things. And the epistemology of self-interest is prevalent. Many of these decisions were made in order to protect the status quo and to protect the privileges of the people who were the enunciative modalities. And finally, those entrenched notions of binary and heteronormative sex and gender continue to persist. The end. Questions right away? Yes. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for this. I also remember when you first started, meeting at lunch, and congratulations on doing this work. I found this really, really interesting. And I want to just ask a follow-up question on your last slide, talking about the ways that these discourses were reflected in the Dewey Decimal System. And I'm not sure if you're trying to explore what I'm going to ask in the work or not.
Yeah, sure.
Were you looking, or did you see like direct connections, like we are now changing DCC because we saw this in the medical discourse, or any kind of like strong directionality of impact? Or, because part of me is wondering, what direction is the impact? Did you get a sense of that, some of those kind of variables?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you're asking if in the preparatory matter it says, we are changing this because of this, no, there was nothing like that. But I think that was more evident in the trans and intersex categories, because people just didn't know what to do with them. And the public opinions were changing, and the research was changing, and so those bounced around a lot more. I mean, and some of it had to do, like, for example, at one point, I think it was Intersex was cut altogether, like taken out but that was an edition of Dewey that was cut like down to nothing. And then it was restored, and then it wasn't restored, and then it was with animals, and then it was, you know, so I think that one just kind of reflected the indecision in the medical discourse. But, you know, you can kind of see, like with, for example, once the Civil Rights Act happened, then you start, you know, you can see the direct connection where all of a sudden we're litigating that. But yeah, I don't think there was ever a case where it was like, we are changing this for this, but it was, I think you have more of a feeling because like when you see the 50s and the status of women where they're in this limbo, you know something's gotta give. and really that was I think the best, it was like a weighted feeling that it's gonna burst at some point, and then.
I'll just follow up really quickly. And part of this is just my ignorance of how the Dewey Decimal System evolves, and I'm just curious as to like those that make those decisions. What are the discourses that influence? And I'm not asking you to answer this, but that just gets me to start thinking about about that.
Yeah, it is interesting. And actually throughout, like once I think it was the 1950s edition happened, they wanted to keep pace with knowledge. That was their goal, and they were, you know, looking at worldwide experts to bring in. And then the next edition, they kind of were silent on that. So must have solved everything, I guess. So.
I just will kind of to follow up because to be honest, also to me, it's a fascinating examination. But it's also this kind of the process of it, like how they work, because you can call it information work, and how it's actually done. So is there anybody doing research into that? It's actually the process of evolving, how it's evolved. Like, is there a lot written about it?
To some degree, Joe Tennis, who is the president of ISCO and works out of Washington, he has a concept called ontogeny, and where he studies the life of a subject over time and scheme change, and like where things go in Dewey or in any classification really. And he's looked at concepts like what's the eugenics, you know, where eugenics was a hard science, and then it's a pseudoscience, and then it's quackery, you know. So he's looked at concepts like that, and so he actually is doing a special edition of KO upcoming, and he's invited me to write something for that on the same topic. So it's kind of starting, it's emerging, but it's not a huge place right now that I know of anyway. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you talk about the medical discourse and also the legal discourse. How do you define the scope? How do you identify them? You know, because there's huge literature, huge cases there. How do you determine those are the major ones, those are the key ones?
Yeah.
What's the criteria for you to make that decision?
What I used the medical, I'll talk about legal first. I looked at the legal dictionaries that are used in the time. Now those are just more for guidance. They're not precedent setting. It's just more of a, you know, quickie. And so I looked at some of the same terms that I would have used, or that were used, you know, women, married women, marriage, husbands, wives, trans anything. Was gender even in there? And it wasn't ever. And you know, so I looked at those. I also, you know, looked at law review cases and things like that. I looked at case law, and the thing about law is that the things that are documented are things that are on appeal, so it doesn't mean that I got everything. And so, you know, a lot of these cases with the marriages and so forth, they were often appealed, you know, I am too a woman, or this is not a same-sex marriage, and so that would be documented. I also used application women who are applying to the bar as attorneys, and then I used for example, the text of the Civil Rights Act and so forth. It is very hard to quantify because it is sprawling and big. So I had to restrain myself from going down a lot of rabbit holes. With the medical discourse, I did have the, I used medical literature, scientific studies and so forth, but I had